All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Amphitheater Hot Shop here at the Corning Museum of Glass. We've got our live audience here. We're thrilled to have you joining us, and we're also live streaming in this, so welcome everybody from the interwebs out there. My name is Eric Goldschmidt. I'm the flameworking supervisor here at the Corning Museum of Glass. And our summer live stream, we are focused on exhibitions that we've got running this year. And we are just about to open a new exhibition called Fire and Vine. And that focuses on the relationship between glass and wine over the last 2,500 years. So myself and Caitlin Hyde, who is our flameworking team leader, we have been working on a design of Bacchus, the Roman god of wine and agriculture, to sort of lean into this topic of wine. And we have with us our curator of ancient glass, Dr. Kate Larson, who curated the exhibition. So Caitlin and I are going to dive in. We're going to be working on a sculpture that is going to look an awful lot like what I've got in my hand here. It incorporates some of Caitlin's beautiful grape leaves and grape clusters that are the colored portions here. I'll be sculpting a little bit of sheet glass that we use for the face of Bacchus, and then sort of networking some clear rods of glass into the rest of the head there. But we're going to dive in. Caitlin and I have a lot of glass to make this happen in an hour. And I'm going to turn things over to Kate to sort of get us started on the theme of Bacchus. So thank you and welcome everybody. And I'm going to dive in on the torch here.
Thanks, Eric. It's really fun to be here. It's fun to have this opportunity to talk about an ancient Greek god, which is not something that we often get to do in my glass life. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to surface it. So I am going to just do a little bit of a background onto who this character is and why we're talking about him in association with a show on glass and wine. So we've got a couple slides. So this is, I don't know if Caitlin and Eric, if you want to say anything about this at this point. This is your...
Oh, I will.
Okay, great.
So that's a very rough sketch, but just sort of a kind of a construction diagram of how we are putting the parts together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along, but that just shows you sort of the process of thinking about how we were going to put the parts together. And then I'll go into that a little bit more in a bit.
Thanks. I think it's so they shared this drawing with me, and I couldn't conceptualize how it was going to come to life in glass. So it's pretty exciting to see this come to life. But it really, the inspiration, I think, for this piece came from this example that is actually a piece in the show. It's a piece from our permanent collection. It's a figure of baby Bacchus who is sitting on a wine barrel. It was made in France about the year 1700. It's going to be on view on the show, which opens on Saturday, July 3rd, just in time for the 4th of July weekend. And this is it's such a great piece because it shows not only the god Bacchus as a baby, but he's on this wine barrel. Bacchus, as Eric mentioned, is of course the Roman name for the god of wine and fertility and all things kind of celebratory and jubilant. So this figure of this Bacchus on a wine barrel, appropriately enough, his hands are a little bit, I've seen some better days, but he would have had a wine cup on his hand, and this piece would have sat on a table at which these wine would have been served as a kind of mark of conviviality and kind of hearken to where the wine was coming from out of this large wooden barrel. So Bacchus goes back pretty far, as Eric mentioned, about 2,500 years ago. He was a Greek god by the name of Dionysus. And even in these images, which are not glass, so again, I'm going to talk a little bit about not glass here. It's kind of exciting for us. These are ceramic, Greek painted ceramics showing some iconography of the god Bacchus and, of course, his wonderful vineyard, lush grape settings, drinking and enjoying his wine. In the Roman period, Dionysus became Bacchus, so here's some great Roman images of the god, and you can see the kind of this youthful Bacchus as well that gets picked up in later on in the Renaissance. We have several pieces in addition to the one that I showed you earlier in our collection that celebrate this this god who is, because he was so associated with wine, with festivities, with merriment, with fertility in the ancient world, his image and his likeness really gets built into a lot of different things that would have been associated. So this is a wine pitcher in our collection, a glass wine pitcher, and you can see that great little applique of the Bacchus figure on the side. Bacchus gets picked up again in the Renaissance. So of course there's this famous painting by Caravaggio, which is in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence now. And it's such a great painting because it shows, of course, the kind of this youthful god, and he's adorned with these great fertility with the fruit, with the vine, with the ivy. And he's got this wonderful Venetian-style goblet in his hand, and you can also see on the lower left there this great little decanter showing the wine. One of the things we're really trying to do in the exhibition is reintroduce this idea of wine in the glass. We're so used to thinking about glass in these historic pieces and they're empty in museum cases. And that's not how they would have been, right? They would have been filled with wine. They would have been interacted with. They would have been held and touched and enjoyed. And if you think about, when you're exploring our museum, think about how some of these glasses, how some of these goblets would have looked with like a lush kind of red wine or a vivid white wine in them. And I think you appreciate the aesthetic of it much more deeply. So with that, I will turn it back over and check in on Eric and Caitlin.
So I think I'll take it up at this point. And one of the things I wanted to tell you about is sort of how we got to where we are now. And I would say where we are now is sort of in the middle of developing this design and also this sort of way of working together. And when we do demos, we do a lot of demos here at the museum, and I think a lot of times it looks like a kind of magical thing where we just know what we're going to make, and then ba-boom, we make it, and everybody goes, whoa, yay, that was magical. It is kind of magical, but there's a whole lot of sort of chewing on things and prototyping and thinking that goes along. And to me, that's some of the most interesting part of the process that as viewers, a lot of times you don't get to see because you're going to see something closer to the end of that development. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how this project came about, which was that Eric and I knew we were going to do something together. So the idea of a live stream that related to the Fire and Vine, okay, so we were going to do something together. And I'm the one that picked that Bacchus character because he's hilarious and silly looking, and I love doing sculptural work and making solid sculpted sort of cartoon figures. And I thought, oh, well, and I'm interested in ancient history and ancient art and that kind of thing. And so I picked that as a reference and started thinking about it from there. And originally, the idea was that I was going to make a Bacchus character, and Eric was going to make probably some kind of hollow form to go with it, a bottle, a barrel, a cup, something like that, because Eric is brilliant at making goblets, and I love making solid sculpture, so that seemed like what we were going to make. And clearly, that's not what we're making at all today. And so the way we got to this point was that just sort of talking over the idea and thinking about the time frame of the demo, one of the things I realized was to make the kind of figurative sculpture that I wanted to do, probably couldn't really get it done in this hour-and-a-half time frame. And so I started looking at images of Bacchus online to think about, okay, could I just do a sort of portrait head instead of a whole figure? And what I found was there's lots of portrait heads of Bacchus, because just like Kate was showing you, it's a character that's used in a lot of decorative art all through hundreds of years. And I ran across a carved cameo that was beautiful, an antique carved cameo in profile of Bacchus with this amazing headdress of leaves and grapes.
Awesome, thank you.
And so that was a far cry from what we originally started talking about, but it started to seem like it might fit into the process, into the demo process better. And another thing that I know about Eric is that he had already developed a really personal technique that's, I don't know anybody else that does this, but that's starting with flat pieces of borosilicate glass and then sculpting them in relief to make faces. So this was something I had seen him do previously for his other personal work. And so suddenly it occurred to me that it made more sense for him to do the Bacchus in that sort of profile relief sculpting, and that it would make sense for me to do the detailed work because that's something that I like a lot too. And so Eric and I have a kind of similar amount of experience in flame working, about 25 years, right, would you say?
Yep.
And yet we do very different work because this is a technique that's so versatile and can be used in so many different ways, and you bring your own personality and interest to it. And so as it turned out, there are a variety of ways that we can bring our work together. And so that's sort of the story of how this design developed. And so knowing that Eric could do this kind of amazing relief work of the face, that gave me a chance to start concentrating on the leaves and the little grape clusters. And then we started thinking about the structure. So how are we going to hold all these parts together? And that's where that sketch comes in, that sketch that Kate showed you right at the beginning, because we started by looking at a cameo and then sort of thinking about how could we reference that in a larger sculpture. And so I started making drawings of that kind of beautiful profile face, and then thinking about how to put those, how to get that flat bit of glass to attach to this other structural system. And then for Eric to be able to take all these little leaves that I'm making and attach them after that face has been in place. So you're working on the face now, aren't you?
I am. Yep.
So that is this kind of amazing process that Eric developed for his own particular work, and that tended to fit nicely into this system. So we've been working on this on and off now for a few weeks, prototyping different parts, figuring out how they go together, and we are still at a point where there's some growth that will happen with this process that's going to be really interesting to see what it leads to. Okay, so Amanda says, how did I get into glassmaking? Yeah, I can tell you that. I have worked with lots of different materials. My background's in art, so I studied art. I have done a lot of illustration, a lot of graphic work, and worked with lots of other materials. And glass kind of entered my life after I was finished with school. I was working as a textile designer, and that interest was all about detail and surface design and color and pattern. And I had a little bit of experience blowing glass at the furnace, and that you'll see a lot of furnace glass work here at the museum. And the glass blowers do amazing, beautiful work. But 25 years ago, when I took some classes in glass blowing, what I realized was I didn't love it. I loved the material, but I didn't love the process. And so I kind of thought, oh, I guess I'll never be a glass artist. But when I discovered the flame working technique later, I looked at it and I realized, oh, that's why I didn't like the work at the furnace. It's not because I don't like the glass, it's because I didn't love that process. And working with glass is something, to get good at it, you're going to spend a lot of time with it. And if you don't love it, there's really no point in doing that. But what I realized was this is a technique that I could love because I love working close up. I love doing a lot of really, meticulous detail work. And that's one of the interesting sort of differences and sort of supportive qualities that Eric's skills and my skills have together, which is that I love to focus on delicate detail, and Eric is really good at figuring out structure and does beautiful detail work as well. But my interest is always on how can I get that little corner to be just exactly in the right place. And so putting my detailed work together with his structural work is turning out to be a really interesting process. And so around 25 years ago, I came to Corning. I didn't live here at the time, but I came to Corning to take a workshop at the studio of the Corning Museum of Glass. Just an amazing teaching facility, and it was fairly new then. And I was so pleased to be here to take that class, and I've taken a few classes there since and taught some classes since then. And that's actually where Eric and I first met, in a workshop at the studio a long, long time ago. Mm-hmm. So, Eric, do you want to say anything about how that progressed for you in terms of your process?
Yeah, most of my learning in glass has been at the studio of the museum, actually, over the years. As Caitlin mentioned, we've both been working with glass for about 25 years at this point. I initially got started, a buddy of mine moved in with me as a roommate. I had been a candle maker before I get into glass, sort of building a wholesale company with some friends, and had this friend move in with me as a roommate who had a couple years experience working on the torch, and he sort of got me started on things. But then about a year into it, I started coming here to Corning to take classes, and that really sort of opened my mind to the myriad possibilities of the material, and also all the different glass processes that are out there to potentially shape this stuff. And I mean, flameworking was the first process I got introduced to, so I sort of naturally fell into it. But since then, I've learned to work glass at the furnace. I really enjoy that. I enjoy the teamwork aspects of working at the furnace, and I enjoy the possibilities there too. But as Caitlin mentioned, the level of detail you can create with the torch is really appetizing. And I also really love the intimacy of flameworking. I'm holding the glass in my hands, it's right here with me, and it's a very immediate sort of interaction with the material. So I have really come to love the flameworking process and all of its possibilities. And this sheet glass stuff, this is also sort of a result of some of the work that we do here at the museum. We have a very close relationship with Corning Incorporated, and several years back, some of the scientists at Corning Incorporated realized that as they're sort of testing new theories or new materials, they would tend to build a machine to test a theory that might cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and well, they realized that they could work with us glassmakers here at the museum, and we could help them to work through some of this stuff for a lot less than building some of these machines. And there was one point where I was handed a stack of this really thin sheet glass and asked, hey, can you do anything with this? Can you shape it a little bit? And it was a composition of glass that's known as borosilicate, which is really temperamental. It does not like to be worked in this sort of a manner. It cracks really easily. And so I've been making figurative work for a long time, so my brain sort of immediately goes there. So as I got handed this stack of sheet glass, I started trying to sculpt faces or body parts or whatever I could figure out. And I had some limited success on a very small scale, really just working about an inch square. And since then, I found the borosilicate sheet glass, and most of my artwork tends to be made in borosilicate. So finding a sheet glass that I could work with and add into my regular body of work was huge. This stuff is actually made to be used for the windows in your oven. So your regular oven or a wood stove, that's what this glass is made for. Borosilicate tolerates temperature change a lot better than most other glasses, so that is why this stuff tolerates this sort of process, and that is sort of where I developed this concept of trying to sculpt this stuff. And yeah, so at the moment I've got most of Bacchus' face created here. We're just going to continue to fine-tune a few more details. We'll add his nostril here. And one of the big challenges when Caitlin came up with this design idea, all the other faces I had done with sheet glass are looking straight on. And with this piece, it's in profile, which changes the equation. All of a sudden, different parts of the face are in the highest relief or the lowest relief. So it's been a good process to sort of figure out how to make this work with a profile shot. And once I finish sculpting the sheet glass, we'll anneal it. We'll set it in the oven overnight, let it cool evenly, and then we sandblast it. And that's how we get that sort of frosted look. That really brings out the rest of the details on things. So yeah, I think we've got the face looking just about done. I'm going to play with a couple more little details here, but we'll
really
pass
nice.
it back off to you, Caitlin. Or Kate, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in quickly and point out that I love that the inspiration for this was cameo too, which is itself an ancient Roman glassmaking technique. Very much in a different way than we're talking about it and you're seeing it today, but cameo, and unfortunately we don't have a nice image to show you, but if you go into our galleries or if you're on our website for those virtual folks out there, type in Roman cameo glass and you'll find out a lot of great examples. Is usually a blue glass with a relief white kind of image that was carved away. So the glass was the blue and the white were the white was coating the blue and then slowly carved away to create this scene in relief, much like you're seeing Eric kind of craft in a very different way over at the torch over there. So I just wanted to interject that I appreciate not only your inspiration is ancient themed, but also your medium in certain ways.
Well, and I think that goes to explain where art comes from sometimes, which is not necessarily where you expect it would, because we're making something that doesn't really look like a cameo. It's not carved, and it doesn't look like that original baby Bacchus sitting on the barrel. And so to know that this is something that developed from those things and from our, sort of separate skills, trying to figure out how to put those skills together, it's, I think, really kind of interesting, because this particular piece of sculpture would never have existed except for those kind of, stream of consciousness process as you go along of going, oh, we could do this, we could do that, but what about this? And then that leads to something else. And for me, that's what being an artist is about. There's a lot of times where people say, well, how do you get your ideas? And you can tell from what we've been describing that sometimes the ideas, they don't just pop into your head. They sort of, sprout and grow over a period of time. And who knows where it might lead next, because I think this is leading both me and Eric to think about, other things that we might sort of develop using the same kinds of processes.
Absolutely. This is definitely sort of some new thinking to think about sculpture a little more in sort of a two-dimensional form with relief to it. Is definitely a different sport from most of the work that I've ever made in my career. So it's got my brain going in different directions and thinking about what sort of wall pieces could be created this way, and we'll see where this all goes over the next few years.
And that kind of ties in, I think, to something I said right at the beginning, which is that my background is a lot of it's in illustration. And so although I sculpt glass, I'm often thinking about making a picture or making a pattern or somehow combining pictorial work with sculptural work. And so that sort of knowing about that technique that Eric had developed and being able to see that as a kind of illustrative technique within the sculpture, that's part of what led to the idea of it being a wall piece as opposed to a full three-dimensional piece.
So we got hit with a question from the internet there. We've got somebody wondering, why, when the flame hits the glass, does it go from blue to sort of a yellowy orange? And the reason that happens is that there is sodium burning out of the glass, and we call that effect soda flare. And that's actually why Caitlin and I are wearing the eyewear that we've got on. The eyewear has a material called didymium in it, and didymium happens to filter that range of orange light, so it allows us to really see right through that orange. And some of the close-ups you're getting, if you don't see that orange, they're coming from the camera that's sort of in between us here. That also has a didymium filter on it, so that allows us to sort of eliminate some of that orange light. So I'm just about done with the Bacchus face here, and we've sort of set things up cooking show style. To make this whole piece take several hours, probably 4 to 5 hours for all of the elements that are going into this. So we've done quite a bit of prep work. We have a whole bunch of parts ready in the oven that's next to me here, including a couple pieces of sheet glass that we've already sandblasted. So you'll see some of that final sandblasted effect in the finished object that we're going to get through in the course of this hour.
So Eric, what happens when you take a piece of sandblasted glass and you melt part of it?
It starts to polish out the sandblasted effect. So I leave these attachment points hanging off the edges of the sheet. So only those attachment points end up getting polished by the flame. But yeah, if anything happens to crack as I'm working, I end up having to melt it again, and we lose some of that sandblasted effect, but I can always sandblast it again later on. It just gets a little more difficult because I'm worried about the rest of the sculpture if I have to go back and sandblast again. But we make it work.
So the sandblasting is a way to bring out the face in terms of visibility. So with glass, you're always thinking about, what do I want it to look like? How am I going to shape the glass? But also with glass, it has a pretty unique characteristic compared to other art materials, which is various levels of transparency. Some glass colors are more or less transparent than others. Clear, plain glass is usually transparent unless you sandblast it. And then sandblasting it makes it a little bit more translucent. Some light's passing through it, but not as much. And that way you can see those delicate details that Eric's working on better. And it makes a nice contrast between the face on the sculpture, which is, looks almost, you could almost think of it like a piece of paper. You get some light reflecting off the surface, so you see that image on that opaque surface or translucent surface. And then other parts of the headdress are more or less transparent depending on which glass I'm using. And I'm using a few shades of green here, and Amanda suggested that maybe I should talk about that a little bit. Does that sound all right? So this particular green glass I'm using two different ones. One of them is called jade green, and one of them is an emerald green, and they're both borosilicate glasses that are made in China. And the jade green, I particularly like because in different thicknesses, it is more or less transparent. And when I first started working on the leaves a few weeks ago, I was making them directly out of the green glass. I was just melting the green glass and shaping the leaves. And what I found was, especially in association with that very delicately sculpted face, they didn't have much life to them. They were sort of chalky. There was too dense of a color. They didn't have the kind of delicacy that I wanted. And so gradually over time, with various stages of the prototyping, what I found was if I take this green glass and put a really thin layer of it over the clear glass, then I get this lovely, delicate green because we're looking through a thinner layer of that jade green. And because of the optics of the glass, as it has some sort of visual movement to it, because different thick and thin areas are going to look more or less transparent. And so there are variations of thick and thin bits of green on the sculpture, and then there are also parts of it that are purely clear, colorless glass. And so you got a lot of different variations of how the light is interacting with that sculpture.
So I'm diving in on another element of the sculpture here. Caitlin has drawn part of the Bacchus illustration onto a piece of kiln shelf here. So I'm actually just tracing right over that with a piece of glass and the hand torch. And this is a technique I've picked up from a couple other contemporaries in the flame working field. I think of Micah Evans and Kit Paulson as being real specialists with this sort of technique here. So thank you two for sharing what you do. It's always fun to learn some new techniques and new process ideas from our fellow artists. You never know where that next idea is going to come from, or what you see someone else doing, how that might sort of make its way into new designs that you develop. So this has been a fun thing to start learning. Mm-hmm. So Amanda's just asking how I was inspired to start working with the sheet glass, which seems like a really odd thing to bring into an artistic practice, but we wind up with a lot of odd challenges around here, and I was approached by Corning scientists to see if there was some sort of interesting shaping that could be done with some sheet glass. And again, that's another area where you never quite know where your inspirations may come from, and you have to sort of be aware when you come across something that might have some value further down the line. So yeah, that all came just from being asked to play with a new material. So I'm just going to trace a couple of these lines on the kiln shelf, give you an idea how this part of the sculpture works, and then I'll reach back into my annealing oven where I've got the majority of the networking done for the piece, and I've got a few of Caitlin's beautiful leaves and grape clusters attached, and then we'll continue assembling the rest of the form.
So I have a question for Kate, and you can say no if you don't have anything to say about this. But in the beginning of this process, when we were talking about Bacchus, I had the feeling that Bacchus, as you know, you talked about how Bacchus kind of is a character that evolved from Dionysus, and I had a feeling at the time that also the Green Man character is probably related to them as well, because that's a decorative character that people use in a lot of different ways, that is sort of a nature spirit and related to abundance and that kind of thing. So any sense of that being connected?
Yeah, it's I think I hadn't thought of that, but there are all these kind of nature spirits, nature gods, nature forces that in various cultures have been kind of animated and personified and take on different personalities and iconographic symbols and that kind of thing. And I think it's almost a kind of persistent trope in a lot of cultures outside of kind of modern contemporary Western culture to have these kind of nature spirits and that persist. I mean, in the ancient world, there are nymphs, there are Bacchants who are Dionysus's followers. There are all these amazing kind of divinities and sprites and sort of things, and they're often kind of dripping as in your piece with these different kind of greenery. They're just so lush and fertile and showcasing all these different life forces, if you will. And Dionysus is very much kind of in that, and Bacchus are very much in that mode. I was totally entranced a few minutes ago. I was just in awe watching Eric's glass technique outlining. I've seen a reasonable amount of glass making over my time here in Corning, and I hadn't seen anything like that, so I was totally entranced just now. So that was great, Eric.
Got a lot of tricks up our sleeves around here. So Kate, what are you excited about with the Fire and Vine exhibition? What should people really key in on that you'd like to get across to them there?
Yeah, it's been, for me, I've been living in this area for 5 years or so now, and for me it became, and I've come from a glass background, I know a lot about glass, but I didn't know a lot about wine when I started working on this exhibition. So for me, it was a great opportunity to connect with some of the local vintners, some of the local people involved in the wine industry around here, and really develop a new appreciation for it. And I hope some of that comes through in the exhibition for people who come as well, and really appreciate. I think many of us have, you hear glass and wine and it sounds very, very kind of like, of course, we're all used to wine glasses and wine bottles and decanters, and glass is very much an important material in the storage of wine, the selling of wine, and the enjoyment of wine. But to kind of really take a step back and look closely at that relationship and think about why glass, why is that? Why do we drink wine out of glasses? Why is wine stored in glass bottles? And I hope the exhibition answers some of those questions for people, and help people appreciate the strength of glass, which is an odd thing to say, but actually comes out of our mouths a lot around here, talking about the strength of glass. The transparency of glass, the versatility of glass, the fact that it is impermeable, so wine doesn't interact with it. And people recognize that going back hundreds of years, that ability of glass to really hold wine in, not interact with it, to really enhance the enjoyment of it. So I'm hoping that it will be, we think we know the story of glass and wine, and I hope you'll see some things there and answer some questions that maybe you'd had, but maybe find some surprising things about glass and wine as well.
Excellent. Our flameworking demonstration area is actually right above the space where that exhibit is being put up. So we've had the opportunity to sort of watch it evolve as it's being installed, and usually the installation happens behind a curtain and we don't get that much of a peek into it, but it's been really fun to see things go up and see what's going in there. I'm really excited. I'm going on a tour with you next week, so I'm very excited for that sort of behind the scenes peek into what you've put together there.
Yeah, we were able to, the exhibition has more than 100 objects in it, most of which are from our collection right here at the Corning Museum of Glass. And many of them are objects which have either not been on view or have been on view in less prominent ways or have been off view for a while. So it was really an opportunity for us to kind of dig into our collection and find some examples of things that are less often seen and surface them in new and exciting ways.
All right, so this is one of the pre-made Bacchus faces that we've already had the chance to sandblast and start assembling the rest of the sculpture here. Realizing I need my Bunsen burner on for this. So we'll set that in the oven where it's safe and get the Bunsen lit up again. One of the catches with the sheet glass stuff is the sheet glass is pretty temperamental and it's very thin. It doesn't hold heat for very long, so it can shock and crack very easily with temperature change. So I'll use the Bunsen burner just to keep soaking some heat, particularly into the sheet to keep things from cracking.
So I've got a question for the flame workers over there. When we do big glass blowing demonstrations, we often talk about the annealing process, and for the larger blown glass pieces, annealing is of course a critical part of the process to prevent that from cracking. What's the annealing on a piece like this like?
Want me to grab that, Eric?
Sure.
I'll talk about annealing generally, and then Eric can fine-tune it for the particular piece. But the basic idea with annealing, and I love describing this to people because it's sort of complex, but it helps you really understand what's going on with the glass. So when you heat glass, it swells. When you cool it, it shrinks. And at the atomic level, as you're heating the glass, the atoms are starting to move around really quickly, and they end up kind of spreading away from each other. And so the normal arrangement of the atoms at room temperature becomes a little bit scrambled while it's hot. And if you think about glass that's being heated, like my grapes right here, as soon as I take that out of the flame, it starts firming up. And if it just cools in the air, it's going to firm up so quickly that it will get locked into its solid state while the atoms are still out gallivanting. You know, they've moved away from each other. There's space between them. They're not where they normally belong. And so that creates a sort of tugging in the glass at the atomic level, which we call thermal stress. And if too much thermal stress builds up in glass, it can tug itself apart. In other words, it breaks. And so while you're shaping glass, while you're heating and cooling it, you have to be pretty attentive to creating gradations of heat so that you're not getting different parts too hot or too cold. Different formulas of glass swell and shrink differently from each other. And so depending on the glass you're working with, you have to be attentive to, you know, that particular characteristic of that glass. And when you're working on different shapes of glass, you have to be attentive to that as well. So the annealing process is after the glass has been shaped, you put it into an oven in a very controlled environment. And these days that means controlled by a computer. So the computer is controlling the temperature of the oven. You hold it at a temperature where it's hot enough that the atoms can all move themselves back to their home base positions, but not hot enough that the glass changes shape. So you can pretty much hold the glass at that, what's called the annealing temperature, for weeks and weeks and not have it change shape. But if you hold it there for just long enough to get the atoms back to their home base positions and then cool that glass slowly enough, the glass shrinks evenly enough inside and out that, that the stress has been removed and doesn't build up again. So you get the glass down to room temperature without stress in it. And that's the annealing cycle, is figuring out a way to get that particular glass, that particular thickness of glass, that particular combination of shapes into a stress-free condition and then get it cooled down to room temperature. So one of the challenges with what Eric's doing in terms of annealing and avoiding thermal stress is that he's got a wide range of thicknesses in there. And so that's what he was talking about with the flat glass being a little bit fussy in terms of how to heat and cool it, because if he heats it too much, it just shrivels up into a thicker bit of glass. But if he lets it get too cool, it's very likely to crack, especially at those spots where he's attaching it to the larger sculpture, because the thicker bits of glass are going to be pulling against that thin glass. And so there's a lot of delicacy in how he's managing the heat to make sure that none of those parts break while he's working with it. And then once it goes in the oven, that's going to be a nice stable place for it. And so then the annealing cycle is, the temperature is determined by the type of glass you're working with, and the time of the annealing cycle is determined by pretty much by the thickness of the glass, because what you're trying to do is get the inside and the outside to all cool at the same rate. And that's a short explanation of it. So that when you get interested in glass and you start going deeper into it, there's amazing, interesting subtleties to it. And when you think about ancient glass, remember I said we're using a computer controller to make sure that the glass cools very evenly. But of course, in ancient times, people were working with glass, but they didn't have computer controllers, and they didn't know exactly what was causing that thermal stress, but they knew that it was happening. And so by trial and error, they had to figure out how to make things out of glass and not have them break. And so there's this very direct kind of material interaction that you're dealing with the glass, and it's great to know all that scientific stuff about it. And to me, very fascinating, but people have been working with glass without exactly understanding all of that for a really long time, too. And that's about really watching and responding to the material as you work with it. And Eric, what do you think? Does that kind of cover?
I think that covers it incredibly well.
Okay.
Yeah, I really try to instill in students the idea that glass is expanding with heat and contracting with cooling, and that's something to consider all the way through any process. I almost think of it as though the glass is alive, and I really have to sort of consider its needs as I'm designing a piece and also as I'm putting a piece together like this. So I sort of have this clock in the back of my head where all of a sudden the alarm goes off and I realize, oh, you better get that thing on the Bunsen burner. It's getting too cold in certain areas. So I sort of work my way around, do a little bit of work, and then get right back to the Bunsen here, and then consider the next move. But I always sort of try to think of the needs of the glass. It needs to expand and contract, and how do I work with that to get the results that I'm after?
Now, the glass we're working with is borosilicate, which is formulated specifically to be able to withstand more temperature changes than soda lime glass, for instance, without breaking. And that the reason it can do that is it doesn't swell and shrink as much as some other types of glass, soda lime in particular. But that doesn't mean it doesn't sometimes break from thermal stress, but it means that we have a little more freedom in terms of, like, I'm making these leaves and grapes and I'm leaving them just sitting out here on the table. They're getting more fragile as they cool because their different parts are tugging against each other, but not so much that they're going to break. And so we have some sort of freedom in timing with this glass for some things where I can put those in the oven later, warm them up, and then put them through their annealing cycle and still stabilize that glass, even though right now it has chilled quickly and built up stress. And so that's what Eric said about the glass seeming kind of alive. I totally agree with that, and I also feel like different types of glasses are like different animals. If you think of a dog, there's lots of different dogs, and they're all dogs, but they each have their personalities. And I tend to think of glass that way too. And that's part of the fun and the challenge of it, because no matter how much experience you have and how great you are at something, you try something slightly different, and now all of a sudden you're a beginner again in some ways, and you need to go through the process of learning the behavior of the glass in that situation, and that keeps it fascinating. Yep.
Caitlin, one of the things I feel like I've heard glassmakers say is that different colors behave differently as well. It's not just different compositions. How does that kind of dictate your choice of color to use, or how you interact with them as you're shaping things like combining colors and things like this?
Yeah, I'm inclined to only use colors that behave nicely. Although, and this green actually is one that behaves really nicely. And I'm sort of joking about that, but actually, because probably 80% of the glass work I do is at work doing presentations. I'm much more interested in showing people the process and not as interested in having to, fuss with the specific color. So in demonstrations, I do really primarily choose colors that are fairly easy to work with. But yeah, because the colors are produced by the addition of metal oxides to the formula, that means each color of glass has a potential to behave differently when you melt it. And some of them flow nice and smoothly, and they're easy to work with. Some of them get a little gummy or stringy. You could think of them like chewing gum that you've been chewing on for too long. Some of them boil a little bit. And so for each color, you have to sort of finesse your process to get it to get it to be all safe and comfortable and happy to get to and as beautiful as possible. My background before I started working at the museum was all with soda lime glass. So for 12 years I worked with soda lime glass. It has different characteristics than this glass. It's softer. When you melt it, it's more fluid. Tends to have brighter colors. The colors are a little bit more even tempered when you put them together. They kind of lay there quietly, and so there's a lot of potential to do really delicate pattern work with soda lime glass, and that was the beginning of my whole experience with glass, was doing decorative surface pattern, and so learning to work with color with borosilicate has been a pretty interesting challenge, because the colors have more diversity in their behavior than with soda lime glass.
That's interesting. Borosilicate is a higher melting temperature glass than soda lime. So a lot of the same colorants that work for soda lime glass burn up at the borosilicate temperatures. So chemists have had to come up with some different combinations of oxides to create different colored glasses in the borosilicate palette. It makes for quite a variety of working properties as well.
Eric, your piece is getting pretty large over there. You've been busy.
It's getting there, yeah. This is the benefits to the cooking show style maneuvers here. I had a few elements prepared, so now we're in assembly mode. And as I'm putting this together, as Caitlin mentioned earlier, we want the structure to be as strong as possible. So I'm not just attaching one part of a leaf or one part of a grape cluster. I want to make sure they're all connected in at least two spots, so it really sort of holds itself together and makes for the strongest possible glass sculpture that we can come up with. There's just this sort of constant balance among the heat sources here. Got to make sure that I keep that sheet glass warm, keep that happy, and then attaching another element as I go along. This is when having all the different voices in my head is actually helpful, as long as they agree at the same times.
Well, and we were talking about the flat glass that Eric's using for the face, and that, some of those same ideas apply to these leaves. As I've been kind of developing the leaf structure over the past couple weeks, one of the things that I find interesting about it is that once I have the color applied to the surface, then I'm going to be shaping the leaf at temperatures that are below the melting temperature, because I've got this flat shape. If I melt any part of it, it rounds out again. And so there's a range of temperature within which you can work where the glass is behaving pretty much like clay. And I have to heat various parts of it to make the adjustments to the shape, but you'll notice that each time I'm heating it, I'm taking my mashing tool and squeezing it again, just reminding it that it's supposed to be something flat, because glass is not really inclined to stay flat when it is getting soft.
Yeah, that's certainly something that as you watch glass, we were talking a little bit earlier about the forms that glass kind of naturally wants to take and having its own kind of life and personality. And you'll notice that surface tension on the glass really wants to make it kind of ball up naturally. And you'll see that as you look at pieces too, certain forms that glass just seems to want to take, and in order to, it's just kind of how it behaves. It's kind of the natural property of the material, and then other ways that the glassmakers and the glass artists really fight against that natural form of glass to make it look different. But those kind of soft edges, those rounded shapes are very, very glassy to my mind.
Yeah, that's a great part of the, I think the learning, the sort of continued learning process of working with glass is that the glass will only do what glass does. And so as the shaper of the glass, you got to figure out how to set up the situations that will coax it into the shapes that you want. And so it keeps you always attentive. You can't just decide and make something happen and walk away from it. You have to sort of estimate and respond quite a lot.
I love that description. I really feel like you build a relationship with the material over the years.
Yeah.
And you learn the tendencies for your new companion, the glass, and start to learn what its preferences are, and you sort of find middle ground with the material, and ultimately, hopefully it starts agreeing with what you want it to do as well. But you really have to sort of think of it as almost a living being, and finding that connection and that relationship with it. Very special material.
So Kate, we've been talking about different personalities of glass. As you've been working with the vintners, are you talking a lot about personalities of wine also?
That's a fun question, Caitlin.
Well, I know I've heard there's so much of the same type of subtlety, in thinking about wine.
Yeah.
And I'm not that knowledgeable about it, but I know that people who are really knowledgeable about it have those same kind of ideas about, the variations of particular grapes and particular years and particular types of bottles and glasses and that kind of thing.
And, I certainly won't claim to be an expert vintner either by any stretch of the imagination. I'm very much learning. But I was struck as I talked to some of the local winemakers about how they described their material, their process was so similar to the way I've heard glass artists talk about the material, that, yeah, sometimes the wine's going to be what the grapes are going to do, what their grapes are going to do, and the vintage is going to be what it's going to be. And you have to really work with those materials to coax them into their best selves, and that it's really a relationship that you're developing as you go along. And you might not know exactly what the end product's going to look like when it starts, but you're going to apply your technique, you're going to apply your training, you're going to apply your love of it. I think that's another thing that really came out when I was talking to the glass or the winemakers as well, is just how much they love their what they do, and how devoted they are to it, and they just live and breathe it and are really excited to talk about it. And it's that same kind of passion that we have here about glass.
All right, so we're getting down to our last couple of moves here. Just going to finish cleaning up the connection of this last leaf here, and then we'll add one more grape cluster on, and then I think we are just about at our finish point. One thing I have to watch out for, you see me going back and forth with that hand torch. I need to make sure that all these connections are really sort of rounded in. I can't leave really sharp, acute angles where different parts come together. Those tend to crack. So what I'm really doing with that hand torch is just sort of refining connections and getting them nice and clean and uniform. Can't just slap this stuff together. There are some laws of physics that apply.
And I think one of the things Kate was saying a few minutes ago about design, historical design in glass, is that those physical requirements of the glass are a big part of how designs are developed too. And so the more you look at glass all through history, the more you can look at something and go, oh, I can see why it was made that way, because these were the limitations of what the glass would do, and this is how the artist or glassmaker was, working around that or working with that characteristic. And so when I look at historical glass, flameworked glass in particular, I find it so fascinating to be able to see the same kind of movement in the glass that somebody made thousands of years ago as the movement in the glass that I'm working on now. Even though, we're separated by so much time, there's that connection through the material.
Yeah, one of the questions I get really regularly about the ancient glass in our collection is, as Caitlin was alluding to earlier, about color compatibility and annealing, and how did they know how to do that, and they didn't have the modern kind of scientific methods and understanding that we have today. And I think, Caitlin, you did a really good job explaining it. They kind of figured out what worked, and they saw what worked, they experimented, they figured it out, and kind of trial by doing, and then once they figured out what worked, they stuck with it.
Yeah, that amazes me. As complex as glass still is to us nowadays, to think that with the minimal understanding of science and technology back then, that they still could sort it out and sort of figure out what would work, and they had the perseverance to keep going at it to get it to work. Glass will really instill some very important life lessons as far as perseverance, patience, humility, all that fun stuff. All right.
And it'll teach you those things over and over again.
Yeah, right. All right, so I think we'll give this one more good flash on the Bunsen burner. We'll hold this up one more time for everybody to take a quick look, but then it needs to go very quickly into the annealing oven, and we will sign off. So I'll just hold this up. I'm not sure what our cameras are watching at the moment. I guess you can see me from overhead here. We'll leave it there for you guys to zoom in. These cameras are amazing. Thank you so much to
beautiful.
Our wonderful camera crew.
Yeah, turn that again. That was great. Oh yeah, so beautiful.
Stunning.
There we
Really
go.
nice.
Alrighty. Well, there is our representation of Bacchus.
Nice, Eric.
And thank you so much, Caitlin and Kate. This has been a real pleasure working with you both. And thank you to our audience, both in-house and online. We appreciate you all joining us. And again, Fire and Vine is going to open on Saturday. So we hope you all will come and join us and check out this wonderful new exhibition. And it's going to be up until
the end of 2022.
Perfect. So you have some time to check it out or to check it out a couple of times. Excellent. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
And hope everyone has a great night. Thank you.